Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let everybody roll in and get situated and everything. While we're waiting, just a couple of housekeeping items. Your audio and video are turned off, so if you have noise in the background or anything, no worries. We can't see or hear you. If you do have a question you'd like us to answer during this class, use the Q&A box down below. That's going to be the spot to put those. There's also a chat box. It's just hard to keep track of questions in the chat box there. Chat's a great spot just to chime in, let us know where you're viewing from, things like that in there. We will be doing a giveaway at the end of this class. The good folks at Weatherby and Peak 44 have sent a rifle and a tripod that they're going to be giving away. So pretty cool prize package. It's going to be winner take all. So you're going to get a pretty sweet setup. We'll post the link to that giveaway at the end of the class. And finally, this class is being recorded. So if you want to go back and rewatch it or review any of the information or send it to somebody else, we'll shoot you an email tomorrow evening with the recording links that you can go back and view it there. And with that,
Yeah.
I guess we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Jack Hedlund. On the onX Hunt marketing team here. Been with the company for just about 6 years now. And spring bear hunting, that's one of my favorite hunts every year. So I'm pretty excited to chat spring bear hunting tonight. Dylan?
Yeah, Dylan Dowson. I am also on the hunt marketing side of things. I've been with onX for coming up on 9 years now. So started out, actually Jack and I both started out in customer service. So if you are a longtime onX customer and used to call in and get some phone support, there's a good chance you talk to one of us. But like Jack said, I also really enjoy spring bear hunting. I am from an area in Montana that typically doesn't have black bears, and I moved to Western Montana about 9 years ago now, and really just taught myself how to spring bear hunt. Had a couple really rough seasons, and started having success after that. So, like Jack said, also excited to chat spring bear. Make sure you're throwing those questions in the Q&A, and then use that chat function to let us know where you're tuning in from, etc. And then I know Jack touched on it a little bit, but make sure you're sticking around for the giveaway at the end. So it's a Weatherby 6.5 RPM, I believe. Awesome rifle, awesome caliber. And then that Peak 44 tripod, I actually just got one of those myself and was glassing off of it a couple days ago, glassed up a few elk sheds, and it's an awesome tripod. So stick around for that.
We can go to the next slide there, Dylan.
Perfect.
Awesome. So what's on the agenda? We're going to talk kind of quickly about the states that have spring seasons. We'll get into a little bit of bear biology, what they're doing at different times of the year, what their needs are, some different tactics, different ways of hunting spring bear. Dylan's going to run us through some e-scouting in the onX web map, and then we'll finish up with talking about some of the gear you need, shot placement on a bear, because it does differ compared to your deer, elk, antelope a little bit. Rifle archery considerations, what you need to effectively take down a bear, and then we'll get into that giveaway and answer some Q&A towards the end. So there's a number of states that have spring bear seasons. Alaska, Arizona, Idaho, Maine on tribal lands. I believe it's the Penobscot Nation has some guided bear hunt opportunities in Maine in the spring. Montana, Oregon, Utah, Wyoming. And I think just about every Canadian province that has bears besides Nova Scotia. I read that they recently, voters turned down opening up a spring season there, but just about every other province that has bears has a spring season. We're based in Western Montana, so we're primarily going to be looking at Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, partly because that's our experience and expertise, but also that is going to be your best option for available tags. They're OTC. You can drive here, right? Alaska has some OTC, but the logistics of getting there are a little bit more difficult. Idaho, for example, you can get 2 tags in a lot of areas. Montana, you can just buy a tag over the counter. Same with Wyoming. So there's fantastic opportunities in other states. We're not knocking those, but we're going to focus on the ones we have highlighted in orange there.
Yeah, there's also some cool fall opportunities too. I've been fortunate enough that I've harvested a handful of bears in Montana, my home state, an Idaho bear a couple years ago, and then what's cool about the Washington one in the fall is I believe it starts early August. I don't know if it's the 1st or 15th, but it's before some of the big game seasons. It was before our archery elk season in Montana. So I went out there in August and shot a bear as well. And so there's some other cool opportunities. This is just kind of a spring list here. I've also personally hunted bears in Oregon with our good friends over at Born and Raised in the spring, and some awesome opportunities there as well. So lots of good opportunities. And the other cool thing too is if you don't live in the West and you are thinking about coming out west to maybe take on your first Western big game hunt, a spring bear or just a bear hunt in general is a really good one. It'll teach you a lot of things that will apply for, a mule deer or elk or anything like that, and really just kind of get your feet wet for what Western hunting has to offer. So
All right, so let's talk a little bit about some bear biology and what they're doing at different times of the year. So bears will go into the den in late fall, depending on where you are. Some states they don't really den up for long periods. States like Arizona, some of the southern states where it's warmer and food's available, they may not really den very much at all. But in the northern Rockies, November is probably the most likely time they're going to enter the den, and then they're going to start appearing late March to April. Again, depending on where you are, depending on whether the big driver for them is really food availability. It's not so much the temperature, but they'll come out of the den and kind of move around and wake up a little bit. And if there's food available, they'll start moving further and further away from the den. They will stay near those sites typically for the first few days or weeks as they're kind of getting their body going again. And that really kind of leads into that early period. In Montana, our season opens April 15th. I believe Idaho and Wyoming are similar open dates. What they're looking for then, that first part of the spring, is the fresh green grass because they need to get their digestive system going again. So they're not really set up to be eating meat. They're not going to be eating dead animals, from avalanche slides or things like that. That might come later on in the spring. So early on, we're kind of getting out of that period right now as we're entering the middle of May. But the first thing they're looking for, bright green grass. That should be what you're looking for. A little bit later on, those fresh forbs and wildflowers. I was just out last night and I saw a bunch of arrowleaf balsam root, which if you've spent time in the Rockies in the spring, it's those bright yellow flowers that grow pretty thick on a lot of hillsides. That's a favorite food of bears. I saw a bear last night and she was rolling over stumps and kind of pushing stumps over. A lot of times looking for grubs and insects in there. If you see a bunch of stumps that are torn apart, a lot of times that's a sign that a bear has been there and is looking for, termites or insects in there, a high protein food source. As the season goes on, you might start keying in on elk calving areas or areas where deer have their fawns. That's going to be, late May into June when they start dropping those calves and fawns. So that is when, bears really have a short period of time where they can get after those newborns. I think I listened to a podcast a few weeks ago where they said it's really only within like 3-4 days where those calves, they're specifically talking about elk calves, where they're not really able to evade a bear. After those first few days, once they're on their feet more, they're able to outrun a bear. So that's another thing you can, if you know a spot where elk typically calve every year, and they're usually pretty consistent with that from year to year. Later on in the spring, that's a good option to look for those bears, especially it seems like people get some big bears doing that, some of those more predatory bears. And then also as we get into June, that's when the bear rut starts. So the bear rut is a little bit more drawn out than like the deer rut or the elk rut. Deer, it might just be like a week or two. Bears biology is different in how they breed and when the cubs are born. So it's stretched out a lot more. But into June, you might see cruising boars where they are just making miles, making tracks, looking for sows. And that can kind of be a double-edged sword because they're going to be moving a lot, they're going to be more visible, but they're probably not going to be there tomorrow. Early on in the year, if you see a bear in an area in late April, early May, there's a good chance they're going to be in that general area for a longer period of time. A cruising boar, if you want to try to make a move on him, you better go right then because chances are he's not going to stick around unless he finds a hot sow. If he's on a hot sow, then you've got some more time and they might be there for a little while because that sow is most likely just going to be where the best food is. She's not cruising like the boar is going to be. Dylan, anything I
Yeah.
missed there? Anything to add?
No, no, I think you covered it really well. I was going to touch a few on kind of just expanding on a couple areas. The calving and the fawn areas, it was a huge eye opener for me. So again, when I moved to Western Montana, I don't even think I had seen a black bear at that point in my life. And I remember one time very vividly, I always carry around a fawn bleat call in my bino harness. It's like a little predatory distress call. It just sounds like a fawn. It's not really even a fawn distress, it's just more like a fawn bleat. And I remember vividly one time I was solo bear hunting and I had seen a bear, made a big loop around and came over the top. And just as I came over the top, the bear was 80 yards below me and the wind hit the back of my neck. And I knew immediately that he was going to win me. So he blew out of there. And I was sitting there and I was, it was like 5 minutes before last light. I was like, well, I've got nothing to lose here. Basically, I was like, this is not going to work at all, but I have nothing to lose. So I pulled out that fawn bleat call and I blew on it a couple of times. Didn't even really get my rifle ready because I was just sure it wasn't going to work. And sure enough, that bear that had winded me turned and like full on sprinted straight back into the clearing 50 yards below me and had his head up just looking frantically from where that sound was coming from. So that was a huge eye opener for me, just at how predatory they can be in the right time of the year. And then also too, even if they see you, sometimes wind you. I've had it happen a few more times where I bumped a bear, they've winded me, but it's almost like something in their brain switches to where it's like, no, there's food there. That's a elk calf or a fawn. I have to go investigate. So they really do get after those calves and fawns, and that was a big learning curve for me. And honestly, a really effective tool if I'm in a pinch or if I need a bear to, step out of the trees or something to present a shot, or even to stop a bear. I've had them cruising before, blow that thing once, and they stop immediately and start looking around. So just another tip in the toolbox there. A few of the other things that I was going to touch on, we'll dive into a little bit deeper in the next slides.
So depending on what state you're hunting in, there's a few different options for how to actually go about finding and harvesting a bear. In Idaho and Wyoming, baiting is legal. Do check the regs because each state is different as far as what types of baits are legal. And I think Wyoming even has different like zones or different areas where this type of bait is legal in this zone, but not in this zone. They always have regulations as far as how far off a trail it needs to be. I know in Idaho it has to be a certain distance from a water source. So baiting can be a very effective method of finding a bear and harvesting a bear. It's a great way to be able to get a good look at a bear, to see if it has cubs with it, to check on size. And we'll get into how to distinguish a big bear from a small bear and a little bit of how to distinguish a sow from a boar later on. But baiting, you're able to bring them in close. You're able to typically keep them around for a long time. It is far from 100%. I grew up in Minnesota where we hunt bears in the fall over bait. I've had, a couple of tags in the last decade or so, and I haven't filled either one of them. So baiting is not an automatic thing, but if that's kind of your style, Idaho and Wyoming are your states for that, and definitely double check, the regs as far as what's legal and how to go about doing it the right way. Idaho and Montana also allow hunting with hounds. Montana, it's relatively new. I think this will be our third season we're in right now, where hunting with hounds is legal. Again, double check the regs. I know in Montana, if you are not a resident, you have to have a hound training license, even if they're not your dogs, even if you're, going with a friend that has dogs that is a Montana resident or something like that. You have to have that license in hound in order to pursue bears with hounds. I'm not certain the regulations in Idaho. Again, double check that. Not my area of expertise. Primarily, the way I hunt and the way Dylan hunts is through spot and stock. By finding those open, grassy areas, kind of like you see in this picture here. You see there's not a lot of thick tree cover. There's some fresh green grass growing. We're typically targeting south-facing slopes, especially early in the season. That's where the snow is going to melt first. That's where the sun is hitting, both to melt the snow off and to get that vegetation growing. My early years of bear hunting in Montana, so this will be, I think this is my 5th or 6th year hunting them. I would just be like, there's a big open hillside. I'm going to sit here and watch that. And that can be effective, but bears also need cover. That's something that I think is often overlooked. They are pretty secretive animals. They don't like to spend a ton of time out in the open, and they want to have some thick cover nearby, both for safety, but also they got a thick black fur coat on, especially as the season goes on and it gets warm. They're going to want to hang out in the shade for most of the day. So cover and also water. If I can find those three things in close proximity, a nice open hillside with cover and water nearby, that's what gets me excited about bear hunting. You don't always have to have all three, but if you can find it, that's great. The other thing that's kind of a bonus for me is if there are closed roads on that hillside, both for glassing and for walking down. I have walked up a couple of bears on logging roads, happen to be sows with cubs, but they will hang out on those closed roads. There's no vehicle traffic, which is a plus for just about any animal we chase, but it's easy walking. Bears, like humans, are going to take the path of least resistance, most likely. And those closed roads typically have more open canopy on them. They're flat. They've got grass growing on them a lot of times because after they're logged, the Forest Service or the logging company or the state or whoever will go plant that with grass seed. I know they used to plant clover sometimes to help with erosion, things like that. Bears love that stuff. So I've heard them called bear highways. So if you can walk them, if that's your style, walk slow, be quiet, walking around every bend, there could be a bear. But also if I have a hillside in Western Montana, it's almost like a terrace where there will be roads all the way up and down those hills. And bears love walking across those. That's usually the first stuff I glass when I get to a new glassing point as I check out those roads. Dylan, I'm sure I've missed something in there.
No, all good stuff. And the cool thing about tactics too is there you can do it so many different ways. There's really not a right and wrong answer. If you like backpack style hunting, or let's just say maybe you've hunted in the West, but you haven't done a backpack style overnight bivvy hunt, there's no better time to do it than in the spring. You don't have to. A lot of the times, like, myself, and I'll speak for Jack here too. Like a lot of it is like, evening hunts even after work or something like that, and not necessarily loading up a backpack for 5 days and going in, but you can do it a lot of different ways, and it's just a fun time to be out there, especially looking at elk calves, moose calves, and just being out in the springtime. But yeah, lots of different ways to do it, and you can either find some that you excel at, or do something new that you haven't done before, like a backpack hunt or something like that. So we'll jump into e-scouting now here. So we'll dive into the maps here in just a second, and I'm just going to dive in a little bit deeper on a couple things that Jack was talking about earlier in the slideshow. So time of year dependent, it's very time of year dependent. Early, as Jack was saying, when the bears emerge from the den, They do tend to stick close. I've only shot one bear in April in Montana. Happened to be my best bear by far. And had we have seen that bear in late May or June, I really highly doubt that I would have gotten over there in time and gotten a shot off. So basically spotted that bear from 4 miles away, knew it was a good bear. And it took us a long time to get there just because the closed logging road was very windy. So although it was like 4 miles away, something like that, it was like a 7 mile hike to get over there. So it was hours and hours later, and that bear was, I think, probably 75 yards ish from where we originally had spotted him. And if you see a bear in late May or June, it's just very, very unlikely they're going to be in the exact same spot. They might be three drainages over. So that is one benefit to hunting them early. You typically are dealing with a lot of snow. I remember that pack out was, there's a lot of knee-high snow. Everything on the north facing side was snow covered and the south facing side was open. So, there's pros and cons to hunting early, mid, or late, but I do kind of like that for the earlier season hunts. Mid-season, and I would say mid-season is probably about now. Mid to late May is typically what I would say mid-season, early June. Um, Jack already hit on this, so I don't need to really cover it, but I really like where there's a lot of cover. So like just a wall of timber next to an open park. Maybe it's been logged or it's just an open hillside, but I do like some really thick, dark timber. And if there's water in the bottom, there's more than likely going to be bears there. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. And then late season into June, find the sows. I've been lucky and found a few drainages with a hot sow in it before. And we'll dive in a little bit later on how to depict or guess what is a boar, what is a sow, as you start to learn that. But I have found a few drainages in the past with a hot sow in it. And I mean, you can see her, she's just worried about eating and, doing her bear thing. And then all of a sudden you look over and there's a boar that is clearly caught her scent and is basically beelining it straight to her. And I mean, I've watched a drainage before for a few nights and seen like, I think 10 to 12 different bears in there and mostly young or, medium-sized boars and that one hot sow that was just attracting everything in there. So, lots of different ways to do it. Kind of depends on the state and when the season is open. Go from there. From now, we're gonna dive into a few of the key tools within the Hunt app. Um, and Jack and I will just kind of talk through. For the sake of time, I went ahead and I just randomly selected a couple areas in Idaho and Wyoming. I am gonna caveat it with I have never been to any of these areas, nor do I intend to. I just zoomed in and picked some random spots. So if you happen to hunt by one of these areas, apologize. It definitely is not intended to blow up any spots, and nor do I intend to ever go to these spots. So, um, looking at things first, just a couple of key layers that I use, and I'll ask Jack here in a second, um, if there's anything that he uses. So looking at the state specifically, obviously I've got the private lands turned on, the government lands turned on. Primarily, I've always only hunted bears on public land. National forest usually, in rare cases, some other public land, but it's typically public land or timber company land that I've only hunted bears on. It's not necessarily find a bear, figure out whose private property it's on, and then go get permission, as it can be with antelope, deer, etc. Um, Game management units. One thing I do want to show folks here is if you go to, and this is the same with several different states, but if you go to Idaho GMUs, go to details, here's where you can select and change the game management units or hunt units. I do have bear selected here. As you can see in Idaho, if I zoom out, there is not a lot of different bear units per se, um, as opposed to Wyoming, for example. So there's a lot of like more general OTC stuff for bears. Every state is different. Check your regs. But just do note that you can go into the sub layers of the GMUs and select if you're, hunting deer, elk, and then see those populate there. I always turn on, especially for bear hunting, like the possible access or access yes in Montana's block management. A lot of that will show up as timber company lands. So you do have to do some research, but a lot of the times timber company lands are open for hunting. A lot of times it's very, very good bear habitat because if it's timber company lands, whether they actively log it or have historically logged it, you're going to find a lot of more open hillsides or at least thinned hillsides, allowing you to find the bears easier, more sunlight, more vegetation growth on the floor, etc. A couple other ones I'll skim through here, so we'll just kind of run through current conditions. Typically, the only one I have on is active wildfires, just in case there happens to be any spring wildfires, so I know what's going on there. Wilderness area, this is one that I do like to turn on, and then if I'm in there, sometimes I'll turn it off. The wilderness area will show you areas that doesn't have motorized traffic, etc. So if you do want to do a backpack bivvy style hunt, maybe look at some wilderness areas. Slope angle is one that I really like. And as I zoom in here, it'll start to populate. So I really like slope angle when bear scouting. But as you can see, it is a little bit overwhelming at times. So what I'll do if I'm looking at slope angle is I'll just leave this open and toggle it off and on depending on what I'm looking at. We'll dive in, here in a second again, but just to give you an example of slope angle, go back to my layers here. So just from past experience, I know like purple is very, very steep, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner up here, you can see that gradient. So 5 to 10 is going to be green. 15 degrees, you start to get more yellow. 20 to 30, you get kind of an orange reddish. Purple's like 40, etc. So, I guess while we're on this layer here, what I've done, the most effective way that I personally have found to use this layer is I will look at my historic waypoints of where bears have been, maybe, where I've harvested a few bears, and I'll start to just develop a pattern of, okay, a lot of times when I'm seeing bears, they're in like the, kind of a yellowish in early May, yellowish on this gradient here. So that tells me it's like 15 degrees-ish, starting to get some slope there, etc. So also what you can do is if you're tracking yourself, you can go back and look at tracks. And I have a couple tracks from Idaho, actually, from a bear pack out where we shot a couple bears in a drainage. And it was pretty similar to this. And we lost some elevation and then went through a couple different patches of purple, for example. And just knowing from experience, that's almost like a hands and knees reaching above you type terrain. So a little bit too steep, but sometimes when you're bear hunting, you find yourself in those areas. So some cool stuff we can do with that. I won't spend a ton of time diving into there, but I'm sure we'll touch on it a little bit later. I think that pretty much covers it for land and access. Roads, trails, and rec. There's quite a few in here that I like to leave on. So I will show you a few. So trails, if I remove them, now all of a sudden it looks a lot harder to get into areas like this. If you make sure your trails are on, now those known hiking trails do show up. I also like the trail slope. What that's going to do is, as I zoom in here, you can see, obviously looking at the topo and with the red showing on the trail slope layer here, like that's going to be a really steep incline here. Then you get up top and it levels out a little bit as you get to the spine of the ridge. But I usually leave that one on trail mileage just to get a gauge of how far I'm going to be hiking. Another one that's really helpful for me is motorized roads and trails. So if I zoom out, turn that on. So what it does is it highlights all these roads and trails, which is just helpful to be able to see them a little bit more quickly and effectively. But where the real value comes in is if you click on any one of those with that layer turned on, now you can see the motorized road and trail. You can see the name of it. You can see the road ID, the length. This is accessible by overland, high clearance, 4x4, side-by-side, ATV, dirt bike. You can see open dates. So if there's open and closed dates, that is super helpful. I don't even know how many times I've had this big elaborate plan of I'm going to drive up here and hike in here before, sun up, and then you get there and the road is gated at the bottom. So, checking this and really doing your homework ahead of time can save you a lot of headache. Um, if you click on like this one, for example, it looks different. So this one is motorized activities. It's only ATV and dirt bike. So all of these trails that have this dotted line here, ATV, dirt bike. If I have an ATV or a dirt bike, this is very helpful. Even if I don't have an ATV or a dirt bike, very helpful because I don't necessarily want to hike all the way in 5 miles on this gated road to be passed by 4 dirt bikes going to set up a bear camp, right? So open dates here, ATV. So let's see, so open pretty much all year, same as dirt bike. But just lots of really good information that you can glean from that specific layer. So I always have that one on, whether I'm bear hunting or elk hunting, you name it. Pretty much covers it there. Let's see, trees, crops, and soil. Couple really helpful ones here. So as you can see, all of these, let me go back to 2D here. So you can see one right here. This fire was 2012. So this is historic fires. This fire here was in 2019, 2015. Let me find an area in the map that maybe has a few more. So there's a bunch of fires down here. So a lot of overlap here. So this is an area that burns quite a bit. 2020 was Beaver Fire here, and same thing as the roads and trails. If you ever click on any of these layers, if you want more information, I can scroll down. I can see the acreage of the fire, fire ID, when it started, and just any information there. But as you look to this area, again, there's 2020, 2021. Zoom here and click. Um, this one was 2012. So a lot of different fires, kind of the same as elk hunting, deer hunting. I think fires oftentimes get, you know, like a highlighter on the map. People really focus in on historic wildfires, and they can be very, very effective. 2 or 3 years after a wildfire, a lot of times you'll get really good growth. It'll be really green and attract a lot of animals. If I was going to hunt these areas as fires, I would more so like right here, for example, is pretty interesting to me. So if I go to 3D and zoom out just touch so you can see. So as you can see, there's some water. There's more than likely this is an actual pretty good creek here. So all of this burned, and then you've got some like really good dark timber right here. So right here would be a very interesting spot for me to key in on if I could glass into this area and effectively hunt it. The other thing to note, and I don't want to bounce around too much here, but it's one thing when bear hunting to find bears, and then it's a whole entirely another thing to find bears in an area that you can harvest a bear. I, for many, many years, was just trying to find bears, and that was my goal. And what I learned is it's easy to find bears. So, for example, if I could glass this area and okay, I've got water, I've got dark timber, I've got south facing slopes here with a burn, it looks good. But if I can't glass this, from closer than a mile or whatever, might be a great spot to find a bear in a spotting scope, not a great spot to get in there and actually get a shot. So one thing just to note there. But this does look interesting to me. If you could get in there, sit on the ridge over here and be within shooting distance, which it's always a little hard to tell, but if you pull out the line distance tool, so that's 415 yards. If this was enough of an opening that you could glass and shoot, so you'd be looking at like 400 and then, a little bit farther up here. So I use that line tool quite a bit just to kind of keep my bearings, basically so I'm not looking at areas that are not good for hunting. Jack, anything else on the layer side of things before I dive into the next stuff? Nothing really in wildfire or wildlife layers that is real effective on bear hunting, but did I miss anything? Oh,
Not
timber
on
cuts.
layers, but what you were just talking about there really reminded me of my first couple years of bear hunting, where I would scout out an area where I thought bears were really good, but equally important is scouting out your glassing points and where are you going to be able to see from? Because I found some great spots and it's like, man, this looks like a great bear area, but there was just no way to really glass it effectively, usually because of timber being in the way. Because if you're glassing a south facing slope, a lot of times you're going to be on the north facing slope. That's where the trees are going to be. That's going to be the thicker stuff. So keep that in mind as you're scouting as well. Of it's kind of that same thing you said of a great place to see a bear, but maybe not kill one. There's a lot of spots that probably hold bears, but they're just not really easy to glass. So save yourself some time and quite frankly some gas if you're driving into an area. I had that a few times my first few years of you drive up there and might hike in and realize, darn, I can't see a dang thing because it's just too thick. So another thing to keep in mind
Yep.
as you're scouting.
For sure. So I just dropped a couple random waypoints again. I've never been to these spots. As I was poking around on the map, they just looked a little interesting. But first, I do want to touch real briefly on timber cuts. So I don't know if there's any in this particular area, but essentially timber cuts, it's going to show up like this, like a green hatch. And then if you click on that, it will say if it was a thin, if it was a clear cut, etc. So very, very helpful for looking at bears or looking for bears as well is that timber cut layer. Let's see here. We're gonna zoom out. So this area right here was interesting to me at first glance. Mostly because as you look around here, there's not a lot of access roads. So these are trails, these are not roads into here. This is a main road that runs, east to west. And then you've got this road, kind of looks like this highway here. But as you look here, there's a lot of old roads here. Sometimes these old roads are overgrown, they might be full of trees, etc. But at least it's a flat, at one point these were roads. And so you can cover a lot of country with this. And that's kind of how I personally like to hunt bears. If I know there's bears in an area or if a hillside looks just too good, there's got to be a bear there. I will sit and glass for hours. I tend to get a little restless and I prefer to go hike a few miles and see if I bump into one, or I'll hike 200 yards, find a different angle to glass for 30 minutes, get up, hike quarter mile, glass from there, etc. And one of the things again that was interesting to me on this area is all of these old roads. So if you are just hiking this on the spines of the ridges, that's one thing. But if you've got these roads, you can cover a lot of country. And then two, if you happen to see a bear, um, it's just a lot quicker and more effective way to get there than, jumping over logs, etc. So just one thing to look at, to me, this area, especially in here, looks pretty interesting because there's a lot of cover, um, some good timber here. If there's water down in this bottom here, especially with even some of these smaller openings, but as you get to the top, some pretty good openings up in here, I would imagine that'd be a great spot to look. And then what I would do too is use this road right here to move up and down. And you might not be able to, let's go ahead and look at the line distance from this road. So if you glass a bear over here, 0.7 miles, quite a ways away. But the nice thing about this area here is you could always jump down, hit this down here. It looks open enough that you could probably get down in here and then still see it from there. And now you're looking at roughly 551 yards. So, some of these down here would be 150, a couple hundred yard shot probably. So just one area that looked pretty interesting on the map that I wanted to kind of chat through. Jack, any other notes as I'm backing out to a different area here?
No, I think you're doing great. You're covering everything I would cover.
Cool. Let's see here. The other thing too, and I know we'll touch on it in a second, but shot distance, again, it's easy to find bears. Sometimes it's hard to fill a bear tag. How far are you effectively willing to shoot? How far are you confident in shooting? Because if you can only get to 550 yards from an opening that you expect a bear to walk out in, if you're not willing to shoot that, you might as well go find a different bear spot or be okay bear watching and just seeing if there is a bear in that area. But lots of cool tools in here that will show you, distance and help put you in the right spot. Um, let's see here. So this area here, I think I was just, interested in it. It's a lot of south facing stuff, but the south face is really nice. But what I really kind of prefer, what I typically find bears on is south facing, but it's not like just a ridge that's from east to west and you have a long south facing, slope with nothing but lush green grass. It's this type of stuff where it is generally south facing. All of this is south facing, but there is a drainage within there that does have some timber and hopefully some water. Definitely some water in the bottom. Um, but yeah, just another area that looked rather interesting because of the south facing, but also with the cover in there. I think a lot of times, especially even too, if we're talking elk hunting. Oh, they bet on the north facing sides. Well, I've seen a lot of elk. I've bumped into elk betting on the south facing slopes too. Same thing with bears. We do key in on south facing slopes. I found a lot of bears on north facing slopes or east or west as well. So I think earlier in the season it's better to key in on those south facing slopes just because that's what typically does the snow melt first. But not not 100% of the time.
Yeah, and that's something I was going to mention. We were talking about some of the biology, Dylan, is you get into June, there's green grass everywhere. So
Yep.
it's kind of a double-edged sword. The bears aren't going to be concentrated like they are in April when there's only a few patches of green grass. They can be just about anywhere, but it does open up a lot more potential spots to see a bear. So it might be more
Yep,
spread out,
for sure.
but
For sure. So this area here definitely looks like it would hold bears to me. It's not as quite as like steep and mountainous as some of the other areas, which is not, you don't need to find the steepest, nastiest drainage to find bears a lot of times. One of the cool things I wanted to show you guys here is the 3D elevation, the exaggeration. So as I get in here, a little bit lower, you can really see if you exaggerate that up, and then you kind of have to go back down into it, but it's a lot more exaggerated here. So now if I'm looking at glassing spots, these knobs and ridges really get more pronounced. Um, Kind of play with it. You can get it to a point where it's almost cartoonish, like too much exaggeration. But if you look in here, and go back all the way down to where it typically is, a lot of the times if you're here, it will look a little bit more topography than what the map is showing. So what I have typically found is like, a third or even an eighth of the way up is a little bit better representation of what you're going to see. The other reason I like this spot is there's a road here and you can find bears and have successful bear hunts without hiking miles and doing backpack hunts. So this area right here is pretty interesting. Again, there's some good south facing, looks like some grass. But what really interests me is this main road. So I can drive this road, it looks like, and then park here, hike through this saddle, really not be exerting much energy. Um, and as I do that here. So I'm going to go line, I'm going to go free draw and start here and say, okay, I'm going to hike out to your right there. I should be able to glass from. So I'm going to save that. And if I was really doing this, I would do a better job at making sure. Okay, so I definitely went too far. I'm going to edit that real quick. I'm just going to delete that, redo it from 2D. So free draw. Oh, excuse me. Move this over just a little bit. Free draw. So if I'm hiking from here out to a glassing point, save it. Now I can see, so I'm going to be starting at 6,700 feet, go down to 65. So that's only going to be 200-foot dip there and then back up to 66. So I'm not really gaining or losing a ton of elevation there. And that is only about half a mile. So that's going to be a really good spot for me to go hike out to. And then from that spot, I'll turn on 3D and I can glass all of this. I can even glass into this next drainage here and then possibly find a road to get around closer if I do happen to find bears. The other thing I like about this one is, let's just say I do see a bear up in this pocket over here. Well, now I can hike back to the pickup, drive down the road, get on this old logging road here, cruise around, drop down here, and be right in tight and possibly get a shot. So there's roads so you can move quickly. Just lots of good things about that spot. I'll show, I think one more spot here, and then we can wrap up the e-scouting. And again, if you guys have questions, especially on the maps, drop them in the Q&A below. Here, I think, so here's just a good example of drainages that go from east to west. So like here, so like the main drainage is east to west, but there's also north and south drainages within it. And then this one up here to the north, kind of a more north and south drainage. Big, deep, nasty drainage. One of the things that I like about these north and south drainages, though, this is probably a little bit of an exaggerated or a little bit too steep of a drainage. But if you get on top of these and you can cover country, the drainage runs north to south, but all these little spur drainages off of it are typically east to west at that point. So you're staying on top of the drainage, covering country. Maybe you set up a spike camp and you go out here to glass. Well, now all of these drainages and everything here, as you're traveling north, is going to be on the southern facing side. So lots of green grass. The other thing too to mention is, we talked about southern facing for early, but if you're higher in elevation, this area here is, let's see here. So this is like 9,200, 9,400 feet. So definitely a lot higher in elevation, probably still under snow right now. But even later into June, if you're in higher elevation, those south facing slopes are going to green up first. So it really is elevation dependent as well. The other thing I want to show here, and kind of the last thing, unless you have anything, Jack, is recent imagery. So and this area is pretty cloud covered in this particular satellite photo. But if you turn on recent imagery, it's going to show you when that image was taken. So it's going to be less detailed for sure, but it's also going to show you, the value is showing you again when it was taken. So April 15th to the 29th, this image was taken. So as we zoom in here, again, bear with me on the cloud cover, a little bit cloudy on this one, but if you go back, so this image was April 1st through the 15th. Go back one more. Now everything here is snow covered. So March 18th through April 1st, everything here was snow covered. So if you're bear hunting and you're wanting to chase that snow line and be just underneath it, this is a really, really helpful tool to be able to see. So everything's snow covered here. As you move forward, still snow covered. Now you can see some of these south facing slopes are starting to open up a little bit. So not a ton. As you go higher in elevation, they're still snowy, but this one is a good example. So a lot of snow cover here, and then just in the next 2 weeks, all of this snow melted off. We probably had a couple of sunny days in that area, and it just melted all that snow. So that's where the grass is going to start to grow. It's one of those things. It's just another tool in the toolbox, but it can be really, really helpful and effective when you're trying to figure out where there's going to be a bunch of snow. Jack, anything that I miss there. I know there's so much more that we could dive into, but I think this, for the sake of time, that's probably a high level. You are muted, it looks like, Jack.
Classic. That recent imagery was going to be the one thing I was gonna make sure we covered. I've been using the heck out of it this spring, largely to make sure roads are clear, so that I can get my
Yep.
truck up to where I need to, to start my hike in or something. And I've got a couple spots I haven't been to yet this spring, but every time we get a new recent image on that 2 week cadence, I'm checking to see what the snow level's looking like. And I got a couple avalanche shoots that I've never hunted before that I want to go check out, and I'm just kind of waiting for the snow to burn off. So hopefully here in maybe a couple weeks, I'll be making a trip out there to see what they look like.
Awesome. Actually, two other quick things while we're here, I forgot. So this is a good example of this looks like a great south facing slope. There's good cover. There's water in the bottom, it looks like. But one thing to note, as Jack was saying, it's great, but unless you're in the bottom, you're probably not gonna be able to glass it or effectively shoot it. So let's just say this, you want to glass this. Well, as soon as you bop to that north side, if there's not a logging road or some sort of, clear cut or thinning in there, well, now you're surrounded by thick trees. And even if there's a bear in that wide open and you're 150 yards away, good luck trying to get a shot through it. Just because of the vegetation on your side. So it is helpful to find areas that bears are going to be, but equally helpful to find areas that you can effectively hunt them. So once in a while you'll get lucky and find some openings through the trees. And then the only other thing I wanted to touch on real closely or real briefly here is Terrain X. So if you go to the upper right hand corner, click Terrain X, it will open up a new tab. Might take just a second to load. So it's going to open up a new tab and load the map for the exact same area that you were just looking at before. So again, the same thing, just different browser here. And you can do a lot with this. We could do an entire class just on Terrain X. But what I am going to show you is just the high level stuff here. So if you go to the left side, you can turn these on and off. So slope angle, let's just say you want to find, so everything's shown right here, but say you want to find key in on areas between 12 and 30 degrees. Well, now it's showing just the areas between 12 and 30 degrees. It doesn't show the entire map. So as you pull these over, you can see that map change. I'm going to go ahead, open that back up. Let's just say you are just looking at south or east facing slopes. Now it's going to highlight areas that are just south and east facing. As you change this, it also changes the map of what you can and can't see. Elevation band, maybe you want to focus in on a specific elevation. So if you pull it there, now you're between 77 and 8,700 feet. Now you can see that elevation band. Maybe that's where the snow line is, just above it, and you want to stick within 1,000 feet of below the snow line, etc. So lots of really cool stuff, especially when you start using both of them. So you want to be between that. You want to see just south facing stuff. You can really get creative. I'm going to go ahead and open these all the way back up and then show you one more thing before we move on. So it's called Viewshed. This tool is going to show you what you can see from any particular spot based on the topography. It's not based on vegetation. So if you are in a really thick canopy forest, it's not going to show you that. Right here looks pretty thick. So I'm probably not going to see out of it very well. But what this is going to do is it's going to show you based on topography is if you were standing right here where I've got my cursor, what can you all glass from that location? So I'm on the south facing slide. As I jump to the north facing slide here, now you can see all that north facing stuff that I can glass. So this is going to just be really helpful for showing you, shooting locations, glassing locations, etc. And again, lots of other cool stuff we could do with this, but I just want to let you guys know that this tool exists and get in there and play with it. So this is only for elite customers. So elite customers have access to Terrain X. I know we're planning on doing a lot of other cool stuff with it. Right now it's kind of still in the beta. We're adding to it. It's a relatively new feature, but pretty cool piece of technology there. Jack, did I miss anything there?
I think we covered it. I think we should get
Cool.
into some of the gear and some of that stuff, and then
Cool.
get into our Q&A. So if you're planning your first, bear hunt out west and you've hunted deer or elk before out west or even pronghorn, a lot of the gear is going to transfer over. You know, we both use a frame pack, like a EXO, Stone Glacier, Mystery Ranch, that kind of pack. Whatever comfortable boots that you're happy to hike around in all day. Optics, this is an optics kind of intensive endeavor. Binoculars at minimum. Before last night, I would say a spotting scope is optional. It still is optional. If you don't have a spotting scope, don't let that keep you from bear hunting. But I was actually out hunting last night, saw a black bear. It was a little over a mile away, and I was glassing it, and it looked kind of like a decent bear through my 10x binoculars. And I pulled up my spotting scope and got to looking at it, and then I noticed that it had a cub with it. So it wasn't a legal bear, right? And that cub was a color phase cub. And it was kind of a unique color, kind of halfway between blonde and brown, and just blended in perfectly with the vegetation around. So your optics are going to be, super critical when it comes to spotting bears, making sure they're legal, and then checking out kind of what the size is and trying to determine that. I pretty much always also carry rain gear when I'm hunting. We get a lot of these just kind of short mountain squalls, mountain rainstorms here where it might only be raining for a half hour, might be 15 minutes. I like to just throw that on real quick, keep myself dry. And then a lot of times seems like right after a rainstorm is a great time for bears to come popping out. Same thing with insulation, puffy coat, things like that. This is all pretty basic hunting stuff. Think about what the weather's going to be and what you personally need to keep yourself comfortable out in the mountains. Bear hunting, in my experience at least, is a matter of sometimes it's just, man, how much time can you spend in the mountains? You've just got to be out there. Bears aren't dense like elk and deer are. Sometimes you just got to put in the hours before you see a bear, and you can't do that if you're cold and wet and you're driving back to town. Sun protection, I pretty much always hunt in a long sleeve shirt with a hood on it. I use like a lightweight First Light merino hoodie most of the time so I can pull that hood up over my neck if I'm sitting there glassing, especially as it gets into the late season. Chair and glassing pad gets back to the comfort. I just have a little fold out piece of foam rubber that I sit on. There was a couple questions about what you do for ticks. Spring bear hunting is the time you're going to get ticks on you when you're hunting. We don't see it so much in the fall out here, but in the spring, they can be pretty thick. I don't know what you do, Dylan, but every year I spray down my hunting clothing with permethrin. Sawyer brand permethrin is the stuff I use. I think there's multiple companies that make it. But I was just thinking, I've bear hunted, I think I've been out 13 times this year, and I've not found a tick on me yet. That includes, some turkey hunting before that. Some of that might be luck. Some of that might be the places I'm hunting. But since I've started using permethrin, I very rarely find a tick on me. So highly recommended. It lasts on your clothes, I think, for 6 weeks. Once you treat it, it's good. So it's not like DEET or bug spray you have to use every time. The other thing I'll sometimes bring is a thermocell. If you're familiar with those, they're also great, especially once the mosquitoes start getting out. I'll turn that thermocell on, and that does a pretty good job at keeping the flying insects away. Anything
Yeah,
else
the
you do, Dylan?
no, I mean the only other tip that I have there is don't wear camo pants. It's hard to see ticks on camo pants. I typically never wear camo pants when I'm hunting, but especially in the spring I'll just wear like a tan or whatever. So as I'm hiking, I can just look down and see that there's a little dot, i.e. a tick trying to crawl up my leg. Um, yeah, the tan pants really, really help with that. But I don't know. I used to really not like ticks, and it's just part of the game now. It's try to avoid them. But I also added trekking poles and tripod to this one. Trekking poles, you sometimes find yourself in some very, very nasty spots, especially after you shoot a bear. Blow down and just some steep, really, really nasty spots. So trekking poles are, in my opinion, a must, especially if you're packing a bear out and have a heavy pack in some steep, nasty, wet country. Tripod, just you can spend hours sitting there glassing. You might as well be comfortable. And then my only other note on this one here is back to the spotting scope. Even if I'm hunting a close, I'm going to be within 300 yards, I probably don't need a spotting scope. I will carry one, especially if I'm hunting solo, just so I can video, whether you're phone scope or mag view or all in, or there's lots of good options out there. I will not shoot a bear unless I can video it as well, especially if I'm by myself. There's so many times where you shoot and then you don't see the impact in your scope and you're wondering, what happened? Where did I hit? Which way did it go? Did it roll? Is it below it? Did it run up to the right? So no matter what, I really, really encourage everybody to take a tripod and a spotting scope and try and video those shots so you can see what happened. Um, we'll dive into a little bit of sex and size here.
Sorry, I'm just answering one question in the chat here about
You're good.
the
I'll kind of kick
unit
this off.
scope.
So, yep, I'll kind of kick this off then. So, bears are very, very hard to determine size. It's it's one of those things that unless you've looked at a lot of them, I would compare it to like a mountain goat or even a pronghorn antelope, right? I grew up antelope hunting, so it's pretty easy to look at an antelope at first glance and say, oh yeah, it's probably a 14-inch buck, or that's a exceptional antelope, or not that big. But to somebody who's never done it, they're very challenging. Same as like a mountain goat. Bears are very, very deceiving, especially if they're, by themselves, which they oftentimes are, and aren't by a known size reference. Yeah, it's just challenging. The more you see, the more you start to get a knack of um it's a pretty good bear, or I just don't know. I've was out a few weeks ago, found one bear, and my gut was just, even though it was the first bear I saw this spring, and sometimes that's a hard one to judge because you don't have a lot of other, bear sightings to go off of. My gut was just, it's not a very big bear, so I chose to pass on it. But Jack, anything in particular? I know we'll dive into boar and sow, and there are some things to look at here.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we were kind of planning this class, I told you about a bear I'd seen, a couple weeks ago, and it was the first bear I'd seen this season. So you still, every year you got to kind of readjust your eyes. And first glance, I'm like, oh, it looks like a decent bear. I think it was 3 miles away. I was able to drive down the road I was on and get closer and got to about a mile. And as I looked at it, I was like, that's a pretty young bear. And I think I said the comment, I've never looked at a bear and it's gotten bigger the more I've looked at it. They usually get smaller. The more you look at it, the more you study them. So spend some time looking. There are some times where you see a bear and and you're like, yep, that's a bear. But a lot of times, especially if you're relatively new to it, and I certainly do not consider myself an expert. I'm still, compared to guys who born and raised in Montana and or Idaho, Wyoming, bear country, and have done it a lot. I'm still a beginner at judging. Um, Spend some time looking if you can, because generally speaking, the more you look at a bear, they're not going to get bigger than what your first impressions are. A lot of times they're going to get smaller.
Yeah, and it's tough because the more you see bears, the easier it is to judge bears, and especially if you're coming out west or if you're new to bear hunting, that's it's a tough position to be in. One of the big things for me is just watching how they move. Big bears tend to move slower, more like lumbery, like back and forth. Small bears move quick. There was one time I remember we were looking at a bear trying to size it up. We're like, I don't think it's very big, but decent bear. I don't know. It might be a shooter. And then all of a sudden something scared that bear, and that thing shot like it was shot out of a cannon, to the nearest tree and like climbed all the way to the top of the tree in like a second. It was like immediately after watching that bear move, it was like, no, that is a very small bear. Big bears don't move that quickly. Yes, they're fast, but they move differently, right? Um, Obviously, this bear in the photo is a very small bear. It has really, really big ears. That can also be a little deceiving because I've seen some really big bears that also look like they've got big ears on top of their head. But typically, a big bear will have its ears more on the side of its head than straight up like that. And the ears will tend to look a little bit smaller. That diagram in the upper left-hand corner is a really good diagram to study as well. But lots of things go into it. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this and show a lot of examples, but do some research ahead of time, watch some videos. That way you're not coming out to the West or on your first bear hunt. And as Jack said, they typically look bigger, and you might decide to pull the trigger and walk up on it, and it's not quite as big as what you thought. So do your homework, do your research ahead of time.
Let's talk about weapons. So there was a question earlier asking about archery seasons versus rifle seasons. Dylan, I'm not aware of any Western state that has a archery specific spring season. I believe they're pretty much all typically you choose your weapon. Do you know of anybody that has an archery specific in the spring?
I personally don't, but then again, I'm I've hunted Montana, Idaho, and Oregon in the spring. So I don't know of one, but there might be out there.
Awesome. So, it's up to you. There are quite a few guys that archery hunt them, in Montana and in other states. I personally carry a rifle. I know Dylan does as well. But for archery equipment, if you have a bow that you use for deer or elk, that's going to work on a bear. Your typical bear is still the average bear shot is probably less than 200 pounds. And a 200-pound whitetail is a big whitetail just about anywhere you go. Some guys will favor a little bit larger cutting diameter broadhead just because bears don't bleed. I've got that bullet point down below rifle where it says bears are easy to kill but difficult to track. A bear that's hit through the lungs is not going to live any longer than a deer or elk that's hit through the lungs, but they don't bleed the same. They have thick fur, especially in the spring. They still have their winter coat. They may have fat that can plug that hole, and they don't have hooves that dig up the ground in the same way that a deer or elk does. So you still want to prioritize getting two holes. Two holes bleed better than one, but I know some guys who will not shoot an expandable broadhead at an elk, but that's what they use for bears because they want to get a
Yeah.
bigger entry and exit hole to
Yeah,
have
no,
their fire.
I completely agree with that, Jack. I would say bigger. The other thing too, if nobody had, somebody hasn't shot a bear or been a part of that, bears are a lot softer than what you might think. People think of bears as like big burly bears, and they can be, especially when you get to those bigger boars, but they're also like really, really light, thin skinned. It's very easy. It's not like skinning a deer or an elk. It's very easy to poke holes in a bear hide when you're skinning it. They're a lot thinner skinned and softer than what you would imagine. So a bigger broadhead is what I would use if I was gonna archery hunt bears. Um, and then, just diving into the rifle, pretty self-explanatory. What you're gonna take deer hunting is gonna be big enough for a bear. It's more shot placement on a bear. And as Jack said, even if a bear is shot in the lungs, if it makes it even sometimes 80 yards, it's going to end up, we've been searching for bears before where we know it's down, but they're in like chest high ferns and deadfall, and they're like wedged underneath like a down log. They find themselves in really strange spots, and can be very hard to find, even if there's one down, and even in like a 10-15 foot area, it can be a lot more challenging to actually find that bear than what you would think. So, um,
Mhm.
yeah, just a few things to consider there.
Yeah, bears are going to go to the thickest, nastiest stuff to die. And They don't have antlers sticking up. They don't have a big rack to give away their location. And like Dylan said, they're soft. Their body just conforms to the ground. They'll lay, I was helping my brother track a bear that he had killed, and it kind of died in a hole and was almost level with the surrounding ground. So they just kind of sink in, and they don't stand out like a deer or elk will. So that's, when you're talking cartridge, I put 6.5 millimeter and up. Bears get shot with a 243 and it kills them. I know remember reading an article, Tyler Friel, who writes for Outdoor Life, lives in Alaska, hunts a lot of bears, both black and grizzly. I think it was last year, the year before, he shot a grizzly with a 6.5 Creedmoor, which a lot of people would say, would bounce right off it. He was hunting over bait. It's legal up there in Alaska, but he put a 6.5 Creedmoor, in the right spot, and that bear was just as dead as if he shot it with a 3.75 H&H. So something you're comfortable with and something you can shoot accurate is the most important.
Yep. And the shots can be, if you're efficient and if you practice a lot, it's not uncommon for a 500-yard cross canyon shot. So just do take that into consideration and know that, I've shot bears at 50 yards on a logging road, and I've shot bears across canyon, where, you find it in a spotter and then you mark it on a waypoint and go down and up and go find it. So, I would say typically shots on bears can be farther just because they do oftentimes, there are across canyon shots. So take that into consideration as well.
So placement, we mentioned it a little bit earlier. A bear's vitals are different than a deer or an elk. Their vitals tend to sit a little bit farther back than hooved animals. So a lot of guides and outfitters will tell their clients aim for the middle of the middle, meaning, top to bottom, aim for the middle, and then between the two legs, aim for the middle. Some of that has to do with the long hair a bear has. A lot of people, if you're trying to do like a heart shot, like you would on a deer, you can miss low because that hair is deceiving. It makes it look like it has a bigger body than it actually does, especially in the spring when they still have that nice winter thick coat. Dylan and I think we talked about this before. That middle of the middle is not the worst, but we like to go, I think I heard this from Clay Newcomb. He says middle of the middle and forward just a little. That's going to give you, the most room for error. If you're used to tucking it kind of right in the crease, right behind the shoulder, oftentimes that will be effective, but you can shoot too far forward and really not get into the vitals at all. And then you've got a wounded bear on your hands, which we don't like to wound any animal, of course. We don't want the animal to suffer, but when it's an animal like a bear that can come back and do some serious damage to you, you especially want to make sure you're putting it down. And then the last point I had there is be patient. Bears kind of move around a lot. I've never really seen a bear that will just stand there still, like, oftentimes a deer, if it kind of thinks something's up, will just stand still for minutes on end. Bears typically not going to do that. When they're feeding, their head is down and they're eating grass. They don't do the deer thing where they'll eat and then stick their head up and look around and then go back to feeding. So don't get too anxious. Don't think, oh man, he's going to get away. He's going to get away. You've got more time than you think. And then also be aware of body position, because they can kind of fold themselves up and twist their bodies where, they can have where their kind of their front shoulder and rear shoulder are really close to each other. So try to wait as well as you can for them to kind of stretch out, for them to be broadside or, like a quartering away shot. Dylan,
Yeah.
anything to add there?
Lots of really good stuff there. The movement, it can be tough sometimes because you'll go days and days without seeing a bear, and then you finally see one, and you just want to get a shot off before he disappears, right? Or you've spent 5 hours sitting and glassing and you're patient, and then a bear steps out and it's like, I got to get this shot before it steps behind that tree. You do have more time than what you think, and the body position is really another thing there too, because I've seen bears be broadside technically where their back legs here, the front legs here, but they're like turned eating down like below them. So if you were to shoot that bear at that time, even though they're standing like they should be broadside, their bodies are like contorted in a weird way to where it'd be like you're shooting a like, steep quartered away or steep quartered toward you shot, even though they look like they should be broadside. So they just move much differently. Pay attention to that. And yeah, I've shot a handful of bears myself, and I've been a part of quite a few, and I have never seen a bear that was shot the middle of the middle and a little forward. We've recovered 100% of those bears. I have seen a few bears that are shot right in the crease, and if you don't break that front shoulder, I've seen several times they'll roll, they'll get up, and you've got a really, really tough track job. And after a couple hundred yards, you're kind of hoping to get lucky, honestly. Um, so I know everybody's gonna have their opinions on that. I've never seen a bear that was shot in the middle of the middle, and it almost feels like you're gonna shoot it in the liver when the crosshairs are on that bear. Like if it was a deer or elk, it feels like it's just a little bit too far back. It's a little uncomfortable, but I've never seen a bear shot there that wasn't recovered within probably 30 to 40 yards. So yeah, do your homework on that as well. Lots of things to consider when you finally do take a shot.
Let's give some stuff away and answer a few questions. There's a lot of good ones in the Q&A there. So I'm going to put the giveaway link in the chat right now. All you have to do is click on that. We'll ask for your name, your shipping information. Since we are giving away a firearm, this one is limited to just U.S. residents. So if you're tuning in from Canada, apologies, it's just a little bit too many complications shipping that internationally. So U.S. residents only on this one. And if you're watching this class after May 14th, the giveaway is closed. It closes at midnight tonight. So I will pull the winner tomorrow. We'll draw the winner, and then I'll shoot you an email, and we'll get your information for getting that rifle sent out to you and get you connected with the folks at Weatherby. So
Awesome. Yeah, good
there's
stuff. Make sure you're entering in that. Odds are pretty dang good, and that is a heck of a prize package. And like I said, I don't have that specific rifle, but knowing those guys, I'm sure it's an awesome rifle. I do have that very specific tripod and really, really like it. So make sure that you're throwing your name in for the hat. So with that being said, Jack, you
Yeah,
got some
there was
questions?
there was a few questions where people were talking about hunting in grizzly country, which Western Montana, pretty much everywhere we go is grizzly country. Any sort of precautions or anything you take, Dylan, when thinking about the grizzly bears?
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about, I'm typically rifle hunting, but a lot of times, honestly, I'm going out with guys where I'm not carrying a rifle. I'm bear hunting with them. I generally anymore never leave without a sidearm and or bear spray. Personal preference, everybody has pros and cons for either one. I for one feel really comfortable with I've got a 10 millimeter semi-auto or a 44 mag. I tend to carry my 10 mil. Again, like we could go into a whole discussion there, but I like 15 rounds and a flashlight underneath it. Whereas that 44 meg obviously has quite a bit more power to it, but you're limited to 8 rounds and doesn't have a light. And so I typically carry a 10 mil and just be aware. Knock on wood, I haven't had any close encounters with grizzlies in Montana. They could be around any corner, any tree though. So just being aware and hunting with people who you trust goes a long ways, and I think is really helpful in bear country.
Yeah, I agree. I personally carry bear spray just because it hasn't been in the budget for me to get a sidearm yet, but that's on the list, and I will probably, like you said, looking at a semi-auto 10 for mine. But if you're going to carry a pistol, you got to make sure you can practice with it. That's the nice thing with bear spray. Bear spray, you probably should practice with it too, but it's a little bit easier to be accurate with the bear spray than with the pistol. So personal preference, you decide
Yep.
what's best for you.
Carry both. In a perfect world, I've gone hunting with guys in Grizz country, and one guy carries a bear spray and one carries a pistol. Kind of have
Mhm.
both bases covered. I mean, my fear with bear spray, and we won't dive in deeper, but is if the wind's blowing 25 miles an hour, which sometimes it does how effective is that going to be? I don't know. Well, if
Yeah.
I have a pistol, Jack has bear spray, we've got our bases covered.
Yep. There's a couple questions about calling too, using electric calls, predator calling in grizzly country. That's something so I don't know about electric calls. I don't believe they're legal in Montana for bears. So to the person that asked that question, double check the regulations before you go out with an electric call. Make sure it's legal. I'm sure it can be an effective method for calling in bears. Dylan gave some examples earlier. I do carry just a mouth blown like a rabbit squealer a lot of times. However, I mostly hunt by myself. And to be honest, it just kind of weirds me out a little bit to start wailing on that by myself without somebody watching my back. So, again, you make the decision that's right for you. Myself hunting solo, I pretty much carry it for that situation where I'm trying to get a bear out of cover or I'm maybe trying to get it to stop or something. I'm not relying on that as my main method of trying to hunt a bear.
Yeah, I've called in probably 10-ish bears with that fawn bleat call. I typically only call if I see him. I'm not like blind calling, hoping a bear hears me and comes in. But if I see one and it's going the other way, a lot of times I'll blow that thing. And I've had a bear shoot 500-600 yards and hear it finally after I really got loud on it and then basically ran to about 50 yards below us on the road. So it can be very effective. It's exciting. Yeah, if you're in dense grizz country by yourself, probably not the best idea because you never know which species is going to come in.
Yeah. And I mean, you could call it a mountain lion or something else too. A lot of stuff with fangs and claws. Couple questions on glassing. We didn't really touch on this. What time of day do you try to be out looking? And then how long do you stay in one spot to glass?
Yeah, the last 30 minutes has always been the best for me. As far as seeing bears. I shouldn't say last hour or so is always kind of the best time of seeing bears. That being said, that's when I'm looking a lot of times. If I work till 5:30, and then by the time I get up there, I've got an hour and a half, 2 hours to find a bear. So I am finding a lot of bears within that last hour-ish of light, but I'm also looking a lot at that time. So, we've found bears in the mornings, we've shot bears in the mornings, midday. Um, be out there, spend time out there. I don't think there's any part of the day that's like, not worth going and looking, but the evenings definitely are what I have noticed to be the best.
Yeah, I agree. And we have the benefit of living in bear country. Most of my hunts are, yeah, work till 5 and then head out to the mountains. If you're traveling from out east or from out of state to bear hunt, I would say don't cut your hunt in half by only hunting the evenings. Definitely be out there as much as you can. Right now we've got like 14 hours of daylight. That is a long time to be looking through binoculars. If you need to take a nap in the middle of the day, by all means, but be there the first few hours of daylight. And then, if you need to head to town, get something to eat, take a nap, whatever, do that. And then make sure you're there in the evenings as well. So, like deer and elk,
Yep.
first few hours, last few hours, typically the best.
Jack, I did see a comment in there that the link wasn't working for bow, so maybe try to throw it in there and we'll see what's going on with that.
Yeah, let me take
Yeah, as Jack said, be out there if you're bear hunting, be out there. There's never really a bad time. Even midday, we found a lot of bears midday. Um, yeah, bring a chair, get comfortable.
So with the link, if you're having trouble with the link, it might be a caching issue. Try it in a different browser or like a private or incognito window. That should get you going there. We've had that with our giveaway site before where it will kind of redirect you to a different part of our website. Try using a different browser or private window, then you should be good to go.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to touch on too, you mentioned long days, and especially if you do find a bear at last light, get over. Um, it's not uncommon. I think the last Montana bear I shot, I got home at I think it was 3:59 a.m. when I rolled into my house after getting to the bear at dark and, finding the bear in the dark and skinning the bear and hiking out, 6 miles. And so you're definitely not uncommon to have some late nights if you're bear hunting up until dark. So one of the things I use, just any satellite communications, that way I can message my wife and say, hey, you just took a shot at a bear, it's now dark, it's already 10:30 or whatever PM. It's going to be a late night, just so people know um what's going on. If you don't get a hold of anybody and all of a sudden it's 2 in the morning and you're still packing a bear out of the mountains, people are going to start to wonder what's going on.
Yeah. And there was a couple questions, and this was something I wanted to touch on, of how long do you stay in a spot? That's kind of the $1 million question. That's when I first started hunting. I was like, man, is this a good spot? Should I just hunt here every night this week, or should I move around? If you're coming from out of state, which is kind of how we designed this class, for you're kind of coming for your first hunt, or you're coming from out of state, I would say if you find a spot and it looks pretty good, sit there for an evening, maybe sit there for the next morning. And if you don't see anything, I personally would move. If you're here for 7 days, you don't have a whole lot of time in the grand scheme of things. So keep moving until you find a bear. Don't put all your chips in one spot and then you get to, day 5 and you haven't seen a bear yet. I think in that instance, it's better to kind of bop around and move to different spots. And I live in Missoula, a lot of good bear country around here. I basically told myself this spring, I'm not going to hunt the same spot twice if I don't see a bear. So I've been trying to hit as many different spots as I can. And I've seen a couple bears this year, so I might go back to those spots. But even spots where I've hunted before, I go there, I don't see a bear, I'm not going back, at least for a little while. I'm not going to hunt that spot multiple nights in a row. Just, I feel like a lot of times if there's a bear there, more often than not, you're going to see it, especially if you put the time in and you're sitting behind the glass. So maybe it's something, if you live in bear country, I'm going to come back in 2 weeks. A lot can change. Do that. But I would say if you're leaning one way or the other, don't be afraid to move.
Yeah, and two, I found a lot of really cool like elk country. If you live in the area, you're hunting the area. I found a lot of really cool elk opportunities, or just learning new country is a great thing to do in the spring.
Here's a quick question. Do Idaho, Montana, or Wyoming offer turkey hunting during the same time as spring bear hunting? Like the opportunity to hunt turkey if you come across while bear hunting? Yep, in Montana, our turkey season's April 15th to May 31st. Most of the state bear hunting is April 15th to June 15th. Idaho's got turkey and bear open right now. I believe Wyoming does as well. So quite a few western states, if you're looking to do a combo hunt, that's available to you. Let's see. A few more questions about, if this is being recorded. Yep, it is being recorded, so you can go back and watch this later. We'll email you the link tomorrow. One question about sow and boar. We did kind of skip over that a little bit, determining sow versus boar. So easiest way is if it's got cubs with it, assume it's a sow. And that's going to be a decent percentage of sows in the spring. We'll have either cubs that were born this past winter or the winter before. They'll have the cubs will typically stick with them for, I guess it's a little over a year. Usually at the start of like that second summer, I think it is, when the sow will kind of kick the cubs away and then she'll go into heat again and may be bred. But I kind of look at, and I'm far from an expert. I've killed 2 sows and 1 boar. So don't feel bad about killing a sow. There's some areas where it might not be the worst thing. If there's a high bear population, you might be helping out the deer and elk by taking a sow or 2 out of there. But if you really want to know, I compare the front end versus the back end. A boar is going to have a lot of times bigger shoulders, look bigger in the front end, and a sow is going to have a little bit bigger rear end. There's a lot of variation, but that's kind of the rule of thumb I go by. I don't know what you do, Dylan.
Yeah, it's kind of goes back to the size too, and it's hard to say like once you see a bunch of them, you'll know, right? Because you got to start somewhere. But once you see a bunch, you do start to get a feeling, and you're a part of some bear harvest and then you walk up, you're like, oh, we thought that was a boar, but it was actually a sow, or vice versa. You something just starts to click after a while. But the biggest thing too is just how they move. It seems like a sow kind of walks a certain way, has a bigger back end, like you said. I've seen, I remember this very vividly. The first, I think it was like the second year I was in Western Montana bear hunting, and there was, again, going back to that hot sow and that drainage, and all these boars were coming in, and there were young boars, small boars, and then a couple really big bears. And the big bears and the sow that was in heat in that drainage was actually a really, really big sow, one of the bigger bears I've ever seen in Montana. So at first when I saw her, I was like, wow, that's a giant boar. That's a huge bear. But when comparing her to the boars that were in the drainage, her back end was like, this is exaggerating a little bit, but almost twice as big as her front end. Her front shoulders looked really, really small, and she had a huge rear end on her. Whereas like the boars were equal almost, if not having a little bit stockier front end. So I mean, that's been the best way I've been able to tell, but it's one of those things. Once you see, the more you see, the more you just kind of have a feeling, and sometimes you don't even know why you have that feeling, but more oftentimes than not, it's correct.
Let's see, there's a lot of good questions in here. Maybe we'll do a couple more. Do you have any on your end, Dylan, that stand out?
No, I've been more checking the chat honestly than the questions.
There's a couple questions on, I saw one. How long do you wait after you shoot to start blood trailing? Do you kind of give it like you would a deer, longer, shorter? Um, I think I
I think
usually
it
go.
depends. Yeah, I
Go
think
ahead.
for me, it depends a lot on what time of day is it, right? Do you have time to wait, or is it going to get dark? Is there clouds above? Is it going to start raining? If it's going to get dark soon or start raining, I'm probably going to go try to immediately find blood. In a perfect world, especially with bears, you see the bear dead, right? It rolled down the hill or it ran 30 yards and flipped over, and you can see it visibly in a spotting scope or your rifle scope, and it's dead bear and you know where to go. It's when you can't see it anymore is when you really have to pay attention and not try. And all this goes with deer and elk and everything too, but don't just go track up the area. Like, kind of have a plan, be methodical about it. You can go walk over a bunch of blood and everybody fan out and look for blood, and then all of a sudden you stepped on the only clue you had, and now it's no longer there. So, um, bears, as you said, are easy to kill, really hard sometimes to track and find. So a lot of things go into it, but if it's hit good, um, I'll immediately start heading over there. But the one thing, and I should have touched on this earlier, it's crucial with everything, but specifically bears, before you go over to try and find where you shot from, mark your exact shooting location, mark the exact location the bear was in the app. So range it. If you have a new loophole, you can, range that spot and it'll drop a waypoint right on the map. But if not, what you do is you range it. Let's just say it's 237 yards. You pull out the app into compass mode. You put in 237, line up your phone directly, save that waypoint, and you're going to be really, really close to where that is, because a lot of times you get down over there and you thought it was going to be really easy to see, but you're on the other side now and you don't know if you're 5 yards from where you shot that bear or 75 yards. Everything's different, your perception's off. So make sure before you bail off and go try and find that bear that you and what I typically do a lot of times if I'm with Jack, I will have him do the same thing. And we're not going to compare notes, but he's going to do the exact same thing. Mark where we shot from, mark where he thinks the bear is. I'm going to do it. Then we're going to cross reference, and hopefully both our bear waypoints are in the same spot. We've got confidence now. And if they're not in the same spot, we're going to have that discussion before we leave. Why do you think it's there? Why do I think it's here? Oh, you are right. That tree is actually there. You're correct. Let's go to that waypoint.
And while you were talking, one other thing I can't believe we haven't talked about it is when you're talking about tracking and shooting a bear, not every time, but a lot of times they will give a death moan. So they
Mhm.
will. It's an eerie sound if you've ever heard it. It'll kind of make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. If you're shooting a bear at a quarter mile, like we talked about, you're probably not going to be able to hear it. But if you're shooting a bear at close range, I know my brother's killed multiple bears in Minnesota. Has killed one a couple years ago at like 12 yards. And he's heard the death moan on I think one maybe of his four bears. So that's a pretty good indication that that bear is dead, and you can feel confident in starting tracking maybe a little bit sooner than you otherwise would have. They don't always do it, and even if they do, if it's a long ways away, you're probably not going to hear it. But just another piece of information to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, speaking on bears end up in weird spots. I haven't watched the video yet, but I saw Casey from Hush just shot a bear, I believe in Idaho, and it rolled down the mountain, ended up he's called it a creek, but it looked borderline like a river. And he ended up finding that bear, I think 40 or 50 yards down river, downstream, lodged underneath water, underneath a log, and he knew that's where it had to be down there, so he started taking a trekking pole and just poking around, and he poked underneath a log and it was squishy. And so he reached his arm down underneath the log and was able to pull his bear out from underneath the water. They end up in really strange spots.
Yep.
So it's, don't give up when you're looking for a bear. Look for the obscure areas that they could have ended up.
That is a pretty crazy video. I watched it and highly recommend it. So we could talk all night, folks. You probably can tell that we're both pretty passionate about spring bear hunting. We've been going for over an hour and a half already. So I'm going to post the giveaway link one last time in there. And Dylan, any closing thoughts before we sign off?
No, I appreciate everybody's time that taking the time out of their evening and sticking with us. And I'm personally really excited to get back to Western Montana and go find some bears. So hopefully soon we'll get after it.
Awesome. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good one.